And we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Adam Shifriss. I run the legislative team here at CRFB. I worked on Capitol Hill and did a few campaigns prior to that. It's my pleasure to be joined by my colleague and friend, Marc Goldwein, who served on the Simpson Bowles Commission and the Super Committee. You can find him on national and international news platforms of all types. He's absolutely one of the top budget minds in Washington, our senior vice president and senior policy director. We're going to spend 30 minutes with you all. I'm going to go through some questions with Marc on the budget resolution and reconciliation. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions in advance. I tried to combine some of them or get at the spirit of many of them that were relevant to reconciliation. And you can also submit questions live using the Zoom tools. And if we get through everything, we'll do those at the end. So when we get to the Senate budget resolution itself, I just want to caution that everything is preliminary. This just came out an hour ago, so we've been going over it. But we're going to give you a good feel for what's in it from a fiscal perspective. Okay, Marc, first question. Can you just give us a little bit of an overview of where we are in the process in terms of what happened with the House budget and the Senate budget?
Sure. Well, why don't we start from the beginning? House and Senate Republicans and the president would like to pass legislation this year that includes an extension of most or all of the expiring provisions in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Additional investments or spending on defense, immigration, and border enforcement and things like that, and potentially some spending cuts and some additional tax cuts on top of the TCJA. There are talks of things ranging from no taxes on tips and no taxes on Social Security to new business tax breaks and everything in between. In the Senate, normally you need 60 votes to pass such legislation because there's the filibuster. But there's a workaround, and that's the budget resolution, which, if enacted on a concurrent basis, meaning if the House and the Senate pass the same budget resolution, unlocks something called reconciliation instructions. Basically unlocks a process that lets you do budget-related things with only a 50-vote margin. Now, there's provisos, conditions to the reconciliation. You have to set the numbers in advance, either ceilings on how much committees can borrow, or floors on how much they have to save. You can't add to the long-term deficit. You can't make changes to discretionary or to Social Security or things that aren't budget to remain. There's a lot of different rules, right? But the first step is to get this budget resolution. The Senate put out an earlier one that was only focused on the immigration and defense stuff pretty much. Then the House put out a comprehensive one that included a significant amount of money for tax cuts, but also for spending cuts to cover them. And now what the Senate is trying to do is come up with what they hope will be kind of the final deal. The budget resolution that includes what the House has put forward and includes what the Senate has put forward. Now, never do these budget resolutions exactly match because different chambers have different committees, right? So there's no Energy and Workforce Committee in the House. There's no Ways and Means Committee in the Senate. So there's always differences between the instructions, but typically they would try to match to the extent possible. They would try to be consistent with each other, even though they're not identical. What's interesting about this budget resolution is the Senate has put forward is one set of instructions for the House and a completely different set of instructions for the Senate. It's not to say there isn't legislation that could, in theory, meet both sets of instructions, but it's unusual in how different they are from each other. And I assume that'll lead you to your next question, but I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about what the implications are for having different instructions for the House and Senate. Is that normal?
So as I said, that's very unusual. Normally they meet. But let me tell you a bit more about what's in them, right? So the House instructions for within this proposed resolution. This is a proposal from the Senate. The House instructions pretty much match which was passed by the House, which is the House is allowing the Ways and Means Committee that's the tax writing committee, to borrow up to $4.5 trillion. By the way, extending all the expiring provisions is about $3.8 trillion. Also bringing back all the business provisions of 2021 still doesn't get you to 4.5. So that gives you some headroom to actually have more tax cuts. But the House would have 4.5 trillion for Ways and Means, about 300 billion combined over various committees for the immigration defense stuff. And then they would require about $2 trillion of spending cuts to partially offset it. The largest portion being from Energy and Commerce, which oversees Medicaid and energy provisions, but also stuff from education, agriculture, elsewhere, and about $500 billion that's sort of not specified to one committee, but could come from anywhere. And so the House instructions, if you add them all up, allow about $2.8 trillion of net borrowing, 4.8 of borrowing instructions, 2 trillion of savings instructions for 2.8 on net. The Senate instructions are completely different. First of all, they use a different baseline. So the House appropriately uses a current law baseline, as we always have. The Senate appears to use a current policy baseline, which basically means they are assuming some of the tax cuts are already extended. They're assuming actually all of the existing tax cuts are already extended. So off the bat, that's $3.8 trillion. Then on top of that, they want to have another $1.5 trillion for the Finance Committee. So that brings the total Finance Committee up to 5.3. And then across the other committees, in order to do immigration and military and other things, there's about additional $500 billion of further deficit increases. And then unlike the House, where there's 2 trillion of required spending cuts, the total, or 2 trillion of required savings, that probably would mainly come from spending cuts. The total requirement for savings in the Senate is only $4 billion because they picked 4 committees, and that's sort of a nominal $1 billion. It's not that they think they can only save $1 billion, their goal is to save more, but they're only requiring that $1 billion. So if you add all this up, whereas the House is at 2.8 trillion on net, the Senate is at 4.8 trillion. I'll mention 2 other differences. One, they have different debt limit increases. The House has a $4 trillion debt limit increase. The Senate has a up to 5 trillion increase. Now, 4 is up to 5. So again, those could match, just like just like 880 billion is more than 1 billion. So technically those could match, but they're really different. They send them in potentially very different directions. The other is the House has this new special thing that's basically a $2 trillion floor on total spending cuts across, or total savings across deficit reduction committees. And the Senate has nothing similar to that. So this in theory is going to set them off in pretty different directions. They have different baselines, different instructions for each committee. The Finance Committee has way more tax cuts than the Ways and Means. The spending committees have way less spending cuts than the committees, different debt limit instructions, and different enforcements.
So let's dig in a little bit on the current policy baseline, because that's been in the news recently and we've written about it. What are we finding out about this budget resolution and the current policy baseline? Is it specified in the budget? Is it a decision that's made separately?
Yeah, so remember, the current policy baseline is basically a way to hide roughly $4 trillion of tax cuts, right? So those, when we passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017, Congress intentionally made it temporary, intentionally made it expire for 2 reasons. One was so it would cost less over 10 years. And the second was so that it wouldn't add to the long-term debt. And so if those costs weren't recognized at the front end, they need to be recognized in the back end. The current policy baseline is an attempt to basically assume those costs never happen, to assume them away. Of course, that doesn't change what actually happens to our borrowing, but it changes how we record it. One option they could have taken was to really formalize this in the budget resolution and say CBO is required to estimate everything relative to current policy. And then there'd be a question of if that's allowed under the Senate, and they'd have to fight that out. They didn't do that. What they've done, it looks like, is just have a sort of statement within a reserve fund. It's a little strangely written, and I think they may actually revise it a little bit, but basically says the chairman can make changes that are related to current policy. And then what we think their plan is, based on news media and based on some things that Leader Thune has said and others, is to essentially go through this process. And after they've written the legislation, for the chairman of the Budget Committee, Chairman Graham, to basically declare that they are going to count an extension of the TCJA as 0. And because the Budget Committee has the final word on numbers, it's really meant to be CBO, Budget Committee, on their behalf, but technically it's written as the Budget Committee. They may be able to just do that, and there's not recourse. There may be recourse if the parliamentarian makes a ruling. They would then have to overrule the parliamentarian or fire her or something else. We don't know exactly how this path is going to proceed, but the budget resolution doesn't really lay it all out. It just begins the conversation that they are talking about using current policy.
And when you say, Mark, that it's written that the budget chair has this authority. That's coming from the Budget Act, right? But there's sort of a norm that they would use the official scorekeeper.
Right. The purpose of the Budget Act of saying the budget chair chooses this is to basically say the committees don't get to write their own numbers, right? So the Finance Committee can't say, I think the tax cut costs this. They need to look to the official Congressional Budget Office score, and the Congressional Budget Office is under the Budget Committee. So the purpose of this wasn't to actually give the chair the ability to make up a number. It was to make it clear that the scorekeeping authorities with CBO, not with the other committees. But again, the Senate Republicans are interpreting the law that even if that was the intent, that technically the chair has the authority. And they've said if there's a challenge to it, they think they can table it with 51 votes. We won't know that till we know. And I think there will be a challenge. And if they try to table it with 51 votes, there may be a challenge to that. And if the parliamentarian does weigh in on it, she may or may not weigh in their favor.
So what's the analogy for folks who aren't wonks? I mean, CBO is supposed to be the referee, the umpire, if you will. I mean, is this like one baseball team getting to swap out the umpire for their favored person right before their favorite all-star player to bat?
It's actually worse than that. It's as if the batter got to declare how many bases he got on without having to ever swing a bat. I don't think that's the perfect metaphor. You put me in the spot with a sports metaphor. But the issue here is if they go down the path that is being reported in the media, essentially the chairman of the Budget Committee can declare whatever score he wants. Now, in this particular case, they may kind of narrow that to only being about current policy. And current policy itself is a huge gimmick. But once you say the chairman of the Budget Committee can do whatever score he wants, there's no reason it has to be limited to current policy. For example, a few years ago, we heard a lot of people saying, actually, Medicare for All is going to save the federal government money. Of course, there's no basis for that. Medicare for All may lower or increase overall healthcare costs. That's a debate, but 100% it's going to increase the federal obligation, probably by trillions of dollars a year. But Chairman Bernie Sanders, who wrote the Medicare for All legislation, if he's chairman of the Budget Committee, remember, could just say, you know what, I declare this saves $1 trillion. And if you can do it for current policy, you can do it for that. And so first of all, again, I don't know the right sports metaphors, but they get to pick their own number. And that completely undermines budget enforcement, because if you can just pick your own number, you can always say you're within compliance of whatever the rule is, whether it's the reconciliation instructions or the Byrd rule or a discretionary cap or pay-go or anything. And so it really undermines the entire concept of budget enforcement. And then if the parliamentarian rules this illegal, rules this against the rules, and they have to either fire or overrule her, it's then on top of that, picking your own umpire. So first you set your own, basically, I'm up at bat. I say, you know what? I think that's a home run, 4-run home run. The umpire says, nope, it's not. And I say, you're out of here, umpire, bring in a new umpire until we find one that agrees that I got a home run. That's essentially what they're doing.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And, we're getting into the season. So can we just go through real quick a little bit? Start with the House budget resolution that they passed. You're saying there's this $2.8 trillion fiscal gap in there, but some members are claiming that it's fiscally responsible. What are the arguments that folks are making for that original House budget resolution in terms of that it's paid for?
Right. So the House budget resolution is much more fiscally responsible than the Senate budget resolution. Let me start with that. The Senate budget resolution would allow twice as much to be added to that as the House. Right, so the House would allow 2.8 trillion, the Senate would allow 4.8 trillion, more than twice as much. And we've done some analysis. The Senate resolution, if you allow that full $5.8 trillion to be added to the debt, it would essentially double the growth of debt to GDP over the next decade. Instead of going from 100 to 117, it would go from 100 to 134. That's double over the next 30 years. Even assuming a lot of this stuff is temporary because of the Byrd rule. Instead of going from 100 to 156, 150-ish, it would go from 100 to 211. So it would double debt growth. The Senate resolution is incredibly irresponsible. That makes the House resolution look good by comparison. And it is good by comparison. But the House budget resolution still adds almost $3 trillion to the debt at a time that debt is already rising rapidly, right? And it does it because the $4.5 trillion of tax cuts are twice as much as the $2 trillion of spending cuts. I want to give a lot of credit to the sort of fiscal hawks in the House that got that $2 trillion of spending cuts. That requires some hard and important reforms, right? And if we go down that road, it'll be a good opportunity to take a serious look at all the gimmicks in Medicaid and to make big reforms to the student loan program that I think has been hampered by all of these kind of debt cancellation schemes. And so I think they do deserve credit for going down that road. But that $2 trillion does not cover 4.8 trillion, right? That's just basic math. And so even in the more responsible budget resolution, even in the House budget resolution, we still have debt rising faster than under current law. And even under current law, we have debt that is going to hit record levels in a couple of years and rise unsustainably after that.
One of the primary arguments we heard during the debate of House budget resolution was that economic growth was going to make up the difference. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so tax cuts can help to grow the economy. Sort of in the short term, they can help with sort of a stimulus effect, give people more cash, they spend it. But over any serious period of time, they can help in two ways. One is they encourage people to work more. If my taxes are lower, I get a bigger return on my work, I work more. And the second is they can encourage people to save and invest more, and businesses to invest more. If I get a higher return on my investment, I'm willing to, invest more in the front end. And those things are good for the economy, no question. But the flip side is tax cuts also require a significant amount of borrowing. And that borrowing is a big impediment to growth. So when the Congressional Budget Office has looked at this, they basically think in tax cuts by themselves, like full extension TCJ, in the first 10 years, it'll be positive for the economy. Not a ton, but it'll be positive. By year 10, it's about neutral. And by year 30, all that debt becomes such a burden that would actually shrink the economy almost 2%. The negative effects of debt become larger than the positive effects of the tax cuts. Other estimates are somewhat more favorable. I think the range is after a decade, the tax cuts will do anything from reduce GDP by 0.1 to increase GDP by 1%. But nobody thinks the growth effects are going to be so dramatic that it's going to pay for itself. I think there's about 6 or 7 or 8 models out there that have estimated extending the tax cuts and their macroeconomic effects. Most of these models are from more conservative groups, and the range is basically they pay for none of themselves to they pay for 16 or 17% of themselves. There's nobody that thinks the tax cuts are going to pay for all of themselves or even pay for half of themselves, which is kind of what you would need to get to that 2.8 trillion.
Right. So then we go to the Senate budget and the number is much larger, 5.8, as you said. We might hear some other arguments about what might fill that gap. Tariffs are certainly in the news today. Are tariffs enacted by executive action an appropriate offset for a reconciliation bill?
No, not for a reconciliation bill. Look, Congress and legislation needs to offset its own costs, right? So it is possible that Congress would add $5 trillion to the debt, and separately, the president, through executive actions, including tariffs and maybe what he's doing through DOGE and reversing Biden actions, could reduce the deficit by $5 trillion. So it is possible that sort of all of government we haven't added to the deficit, but Congress is responsible for its own budget. I'll also say that while that's theoretically possible, and I know we are competing against the president's announcement of tariffs, and so therefore I don't know what the tariffs are going to be today. It is hard for me to imagine enough money coming out of the executive branch, even with very aggressive tariffs, to cover this cost. There's sort of kind of there's a Laffer curve for tariffs, right? The more you raise tariffs, the less you get, both because the less you get for each additional percent, both because you get less trade and because you start to hurt the economy more and there's more retaliation and things like that. So it's hard to imagine more than, say, 3 trillion or so in total from tariffs. That would require some pretty aggressive changes to the tariff law.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's also, there's the accountability piece where Congress needs to offset its own laws, but there's also executive actions can be turned on by the president and turned off by the president. And if you designed a law where all of the candy is in law and is, permanent, and all of the vegetables can be turned off by the president, you're creating a real problem there.
That's right. Look, neither laws nor executive actions are ever permanent in the sense that a future Congress can undo laws and a future president can do executive actions. But laws are much sturdier than executive actions. And in particular, executive actions that are announced sort of in the context of these are going to change based on other countries' response, right? So I'd say the tariffs are particularly unsturdy because in the case of retaliatory tariffs, they're not meant to be permanent, right? So at least part of the goal is to get other countries to lower tariffs on us, and then presumably we would in turn. I'd also say when they're this aggressive and large, it increases the likelihood they're not going to last. So yes, the executive, I think, taking something that the president has done for a couple of month period and assuming it will be permanent to pay for what is a permanent change in law would be a big mistake, separate from the accountability aspect of it all, and separate from the fact that our debt is so unsustainable that we really shouldn't be adding to the deficit in any major context, whether it's offset somewhere else or not.
Thanks, Mark. So another potential group of savings coming out of the administration is the Department of Government Efficiency. And we've gotten several questions from the audience, so I'll try to combine them into one or two. But, can savings from DOGE be counted towards reconciliation, kind of if they're enacted on the executive side? And then the second piece is, could some of them be codified through a reconciliation bill?
Yeah. So the first answer, like, can DOGE just as it is be counted under reconciliation? It's the same as my tariff answer, right? So in theory, DOGE can save money. It's useful to look at the entirety of government to understand what you're doing, but that cannot be a pay for legislation. With that said, Congress has to say here to codify a lot of what DOGE is doing, right? So a lot of these DOGE changes, and it's now hard to know what's DOGE and what's agency changes, but they are freezing funding and they are reducing the federal workforce, and ultimately the money still exists there. The budget authority still exists. The administration just isn't spending it, which means that a reconciliation bill could rescind that money. In order to do that, by the way, they'd have to give the Appropriations Committee an instruction. They think they're reticent to do that because it's kind of counter to tradition, but there's no reason budget resolution couldn't say the Appropriations Committee must save at least X billion. Could even be 1 billion and give them a very nominal floor. And then they could put together a rescissions package within the reconciliation that can codify a lot of what DOGE is doing on the discretionary side. The other part of what DOGE is doing apparently is on the sort of program integrity side that may cross into mandatory, right? Making sure we're not paying beneficiaries that aren't supposed to be collecting benefits. And again, if DOGE has good ideas of how to codify those into law, they may be able to be done in reconciliation. They may not, because they may not be budget germane or in order, but there's opportunities there. But DOGE needs to talk to Congress for that. They need to let Congress know, here's what we found. And then they need to work with Congress to figure out, okay, now how can you change the law to make sure this stops happening?
So let's say you were someone, who supported the House budget, and you want to see the final budget resolution reach the House level of savings. What would you need to see changed in the Senate budget resolution to kind of guarantee that House level of savings?
So I kind of think there's deficit hawks and there's spending hawks. And for deficit hawks, the Senate budget is borrowing $3 trillion more than the House, right? The House wants to borrow 2.8. The Senate wants to borrow 5.8. Both are bad, but the Senate one is way higher. So we got to get that number way, way down, right? And the key way to get that down in the Senate, first of all, have some saving numbers that are not $1 billion. I'll get to this in spending in a second. But secondly, the key way to get that down is to reduce the finance number. If you were going off a current policy baseline, and they shouldn't be. So first of all, ditch the current policy baseline, be honest about your numbers. But if you are insisting on lying about your numbers to the current policy baseline, the Finance Committee should be a saver, not a coster. There's no reason it shouldn't. The Finance Committee has the authority over the vast majority of money in all of government. They have, within reconciliation authority, they have Medicare, they have Medicaid, they have a lot of welfare programs, they have ACA, they have IRA, and by the way, they have all the tax breaks in the tax code, a lot of which are really backwards. So the Finance Committee should be saving money relative to foreign policy. Now, if you're a spending hawk, maybe you don't care as much about that 5.8 versus the 2.8, but maybe you care about the fact that the House is saving $2 trillion. By the way, that's $2 trillion out of 86 trillion. So that's not all that much in the context of things, but it was hard fought and that's good. And you get a lot of good policy savings out of $2 trillion. The Senate is saving a minimum of $4 billion. I mean, you got to be kidding me. We have a meme contest going right now. So everyone should go on X and follow Budget Hawks. And I used Grok, I cheated, but make your own meme about like $4 billion of savings. I mean, these guys have been talking about how they got to cut spending. 4 billion out of 86 trillion. Come on, that is, give me a freaking break. So we got to get those numbers up, right? And in the Senate, that starts with the obvious things like the education, the Health, Education, Labor, Pensions Committee, HELP, should have a target that is over 300 billion, not 1 billion. That would more match the Senate. The Agriculture Committee should have a savings that's over 200 billion, not 1 billion. That would match the House. Excuse me, match the House. It gets more complicated with what you do about the 880 billion of energy and commerce, because that's split between the sort of energy, environment, and finance committees. So you got to figure out how to allocate that. But you can do it. You can allocate every single dollar, or you can leave yourself some flexibility, allocate most of those dollars, and then put an overall floor or an overall ceiling. That's what the House did. They have a $2 trillion overall floor. You could do kind of the same thing. You have to adjust the number, it'd be more like 1.3 or 1.4 or 1.5 trillion, be a similar overall floor with a backstop that the finance committee number gets reduced. So there's no particular reason. I don't buy this flexibility argument. Flexibility is why you might do 300 instead of 330. It's not why you do 1 instead of 330.
Thanks, Mark. Can you talk a little bit about the history of the debt limit, and is it typical to have a $5 trillion debt limit increase alongside a $5.8 trillion increase of the debt?
Yeah, I mean, it's happened that we raised the debt limit, we raised the debt, but the tradition has been for non-clean debt limit increases that you use the increase in the debt limit as an opportunity to take stock of your fiscal situation. I want to say something, first of all, you have to raise or suspend the debt limit. It's no question. These are like, morally you have to do it because these are obligations you already made, but economically you have to do it because otherwise you could put the bond market in turmoil and you can default on our obligations to pay. So you have to raise the debt limit. Just like you got to pay your credit card debt, right? But if your credit card debt keeps coming in at a higher rate than you're comfortable paying, when you get the bill, it's probably a good time to reassess, am I spending too much? Do I need to pick up additional shifts at work? And the federal government should be doing the same. When they raise the debt limit, they should be thinking like, okay, are there places we can reduce spending? Are there places we can increase revenue? And historically, it's often what they've done, right? The Grand-Rudman, the deficit targets, the deficit caps in the 80s were on debt limit. Most of the budget deals we had in the 90s were on the debt limit. Simpson-Bowles was created out of a side negotiation from a debt limit. Statutory pay-go, the Budget Control Act, the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Budget debt limits are often an opportunity to reduce debt. Often they're clean. It's really sad when we are raising the debt limit just to give ourselves a permission structure to add an additional $5.8 trillion to the debt.
Thanks so much, Mark. Look, we set this for 30 minutes, so I want to respect people's time. We will not be insulted if folks have to hop off, but we are going to just go a couple minutes over here because there's a few specific questions that I think people would appreciate if we could get in. They're a little bit more tailored than some of the general stuff. We got someone asking, this promise to remove taxes on Social Security benefits. 1, is that going to make it in? 2, what are the procedural issues with reconciliation in this proposal?
Right. So here's the situation. First of all, Social Security benefits are partially subject to tax. It's a complicated formula, but basically above a certain income threshold, half of them are subject to income tax. Above a different threshold, 85% of them are. That 50% goes into helping to support Social Security. The additional 35% goes in helping to support Medicare. The exact structure is kind of messed up and needs to be fixed, but the concept that this income should be taxed makes sense in the context of an income tax because it's not all taxed upfront. And so it's not, we don't have the right design, but we have the right basic tax policy right now. Eliminating that, and this is before I get to the procedure, eliminating that would cost over $1 trillion, would reduce revenue by over $1 trillion, probably close to 1.2 trillion over a decade. It would also advance the insolvency date of Social Security by a couple of years. Social Security is 8 years from insolvency. This would make that much worse. It'd probably make it 6 or 7 years, and it would increase the long-term gap, and it would make Medicare insolvent worse. So it's sort of like not a smart policy, right? It moves towards worse tax policy. The benefits, by the way, mainly they disproportionately accrue to the very richest seniors. So it's pretty regressive. It's bad tax policy. It puts Social Security and Medicare in jeopardy. It's also probably not allowed under reconciliation. I say probably in part because if the chair of the budget committee can sort of set the score whatever he wants, they may be able to get around that as well. But it shouldn't be allowed. And the reason is that 50% that goes into Social Security is sort of part of the Social Security financing, and you can't really directly change Social Security in reconciliation. But that doesn't mean they couldn't do some things in reconciliation. First of all, that 35% that goes into Medicare, that is fair game. That is, even though it's a tax on Social Security, it's not a change to Social Security. It's a change to the Medicare financing. In fact, it was created under a reconciliation bill, and so that could be cut. And so they could reduce taxation of benefits without eliminating taxation of benefits. Alternatively, and this is what I hear they could do, they might do, they could just make changes to the income tax more generally, whether it's a tax credit or a bigger standard deduction for seniors, other things like that, that wouldn't actually eliminate taxation of benefits, but would have the indirect effect of giving tax cuts to the same folks. These would be expensive propositions that reduce taxes for a population that is quite wealthy. You know, there are seniors that are really, really struggling. But as a cohort, our seniors are the wealthiest population in the history of the known universe. And the ones that are already paying significant income taxes are the wealthiest among those. So I don't think this is a wise use of dollars. And Social Security benefits are kind of keep growing over time. But there's ways to design it that are BIRD compliant. You just can't, in my opinion, get rid of taxation of Social Security benefits in full.
Thanks, Mark. And apologies if you mentioned this earlier, but what's the long term, what's the 30-year effect of extending TCJA without offsets?
Yeah, so we've done the estimates. Actually, I shouldn't say we did this, but CBO did the estimates as a percent of GDP. And all we did was convert into dollars. I shouldn't say all we did. I have a great team that does a lot of amazing analysis, but this is one of the easier ones because it was just a multiplication problem. And basically what we found is that just extending the expiring balance of the TCJA over 30 years would add $37 trillion to the debt. Now, the Senate budget resolution would be worse than that, because remember, the Senate budget resolution has an additional $2 trillion. I'm sorry, that's $37 trillion before interest, right? Is it? I have to check on that. Somebody tell my team, remind me if it's before or after interest. But the Senate budget resolution would actually add an additional $2 trillion in the first decade. And while when we've run the numbers, we assume that that doesn't continue. The game here is probably that they're going to do some temporary tax policies, like no tax on tips temporarily, for example, and then do this current policy game later to make them permanent, right? So if they're doing current policy once, there's no reason to expect they won't do it again. And this is actually like one of the most egregious of the current policy gimmicks, because the current policy double gimmick. Score your existing policies against current policy, but count your new policies as if they're current law. And in that case, we could talk about way more than 37 trillion. We could be talking about 50 or 60 trillion dollars over 3 decades.
Thanks, Mark. We have someone asking about whether it's possible to raise the Social Security retirement age through reconciliation.
You cannot raise the Social Security retirement age through reconciliation because, again, it's a change to Social Security. You can raise the Medicare age of 65. Look, Social Security is in really bad shape. It is 8 years from insolvency, and it has a gap that's basically equivalent to a quarter of all of its benefits or a third of all its revenue. We're going to need changes to it, but under the current Senate rules, those changes require 60 votes, which means there's not going to be a partisan reconciliation solution. There's probably going to be a bipartisan solution, and lawmakers ought to get on that 30 years ago. But if not then, it should be the first thing they do after reconciliation.
Okay, last one. There was a time, some of our viewers I remember, when Congress and both parties took the budget resolution pretty seriously as a governing plan for the country. And they would set a goal, and they didn't always follow it, but they had a discussion about it, and there are rules in both chambers to try to adhere to that goal. And in the modern budget process, there's sort of this golden goose of reconciliation And when either party takes charge, they try to use it to get through their preferred policies with 51 votes in the Senate. But if you're using the budget process how it's supposed to be used, you want to pick a fiscal goal. And there have been some members and even the president talk about balancing the budget. So how does, what the House and Senate are working on affect the goal of balancing the budget?
Yeah, I mean, it makes it incredibly harder. I saw that you just put out our analysis, but let me first say, we're not going to balance the budget. So I think we should a little bit put that out of mind as something that's likely to happen. But, and the reason is it would take $15 trillion over a decade of savings to balance the budget. And that's an awful lot of taxes and an awful lot of spending cuts. But if we enact the Senate budget resolution, instead of 15 trillion, it's probably going to be 22 trillion or something in that neighborhood. It makes it even harder. What we can do is begin to move towards a more stable debt. And one way to do that, one, I think reasonable fiscal target is to say we want debt to GDP to not go above 100% and then to start declining, even if it's a very gradual decline, or stabilize and decline. Another idea is to stabilize the deficit at 3% of GDP. We've heard the Secretary of Treasury talk about that. That would probably work. 3% of GDP would probably give us a sustainable debt or a primary balance. There's lots of different fiscal goals. And as you said, the budget resolution used to be used to achieve those fiscal goals. We used to set out our plan and we would work toward that plan. Congress almost never enacted everything in the budget resolution, but they used to try. Now they no longer try. Now they just want to get reconciliation. What I worry about is this current policy decision, not to actually switch baselines even, but to declare that the chair of the budget committee can decide his own number or her own number. It takes us down the path that even the reconciliation part of the budget resolution is falling apart, because the thing about reconciliation is it has enforcement tied to it. It has rules. You have to set a number and you got to stick to it, right? And so you can set whatever number you want, but you have to first declare we're going to borrow no more than $2 trillion. Then you actually have to do that. And then you can't add to the long-term debt. If the budget committee can set their own numbers, if the chair of the budget committee can set his or her own numbers, the sky is the limit, right? And at that point, I'm not even clear why we have a budget process anymore.
Thank you, Mark. We have a couple folks asking, you mentioned the $5.8 trillion number for the new budget kind of early in the call. If you could just kind of really briefly go over the arithmetic on that again, because that's what's newsy, and then we'll go ahead and let people go.
Sure, absolutely. So there's 1.5 trillion of allowable borrowing for the Finance Committee. Then the committees that are mostly covering immigration and defense-related policy, right? So the Armed Services Committee, Judiciary, Homeland Security, a little bit of other stuff related to energy, et cetera. Those are a bit over 500 billion. So you add those up, that's basically $2 trillion in change. But then they're adopting the current policy baseline. And that current policy baseline, we think the one they're going to use, because there's no such thing as a current policy baseline, but we think the one they're going to use is 3.8 trillion. So if you add that all, that's $5.8 trillion of change. Oh, and I forgot to subtract the $4 billion of spending cuts, which by my math still puts us at $5.8 trillion, because I just want to say again, $4 billion of spending cuts is a joke. And they can do better and we have to do better.
Thank you so much, Mark. Really informative, and thanks to everyone who joined and for your positive comments and questions. We will be covering this on an ongoing basis, so keep an eye on our reconciliation resources page where all of our reconciliation and budget process work will live. Keep an eye on crfb.org. And I just want to make one plug before I hang up, which is for all the Hill staff on the call, we have a really fantastic program called the Fiscal Security Leadership Initiative that connects foreign policy, defense, homeland security, national security issues to the bigger picture budget issues and debt and deficits. It's a 6-week program. It starts soon. Got an awesome group so far, but applications close tomorrow. So if you're interested, putting the link in the chat. And with that, thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful Wednesday.